glad to see you're back. We're going to have a really great session with Dr. Stephanie Stollar. She is currently the founder of Stephanie Stollar Consulting, and she is the former Vice President of Professional Learning for Acadience Learning, Inc., where she supported the use of Acadience reading and other literacy and math assessments through research and professional learning opportunities. Dr. Stollar has worked as a school psychologist, educational consultant, and assistant professor. Her work and publications have focused on assessment for prevention and intervention, collaborative problem solving, and systems change. And today she's going to talk about dyslexia screening and the use of Acadience reading K through 6. I just wanted to let everybody know that, to ask you to please turn off your videos and mute yourself if you're not already. And we will go ahead and get started. Thanks, Dr. Stollar.
Thanks, Jenny, so much. I appreciate everything that the whole patent team has done to produce this enormously successful event. This is quite an undertaking, and we appreciate all of your efforts. And I want to thank everybody who is joining us today for giving some of your time on this summer afternoon to talk about dyslexia screening and the use of Acadience reading K-6. So we're going to be focusing today on sort of delineating the way that you could conceptualize screening for dyslexia in using Acadience reading, an assessment that you may already be using for universal screening and progress monitoring 3 times a year. Acadience reading is the new name for the Dibbles Next assessment from the authors Roland Good and Ruth Kaminsky, and you can learn more about their assessments at acadiancelearning.org. You can also find more information about the things I'll be sharing today on that website as well. So I'm going to start with the end in mind here. I'm going to give you the big takeaways as a frame for getting us started. Decisions about screening for dyslexia really need to happen in a particular context to be most effective. And one element of that context is prevention. Whenever we're doing screening, the most important element of that is acting on that information as soon as possible. When it comes to reading in particular, prevention is the battle cry. We need to be focused on preventing reading problems from happening in the first place. So screening for dyslexia is happening within that context of prevention, early intervention, and then for older students, as we need to, the context of remediation as well. Good decisions are ones that improve outcomes for students. We're focused, we're driven by getting students to better reading outcomes. So we want to prioritize the things that we can do something about, and then we actually have to do something about them. That might seem like, well, duh, but I see a lot of screening happening around the country without action. And we need to make sure and keep in mind as we're having this conversation today that it's critically important to act on the screening data. And finally, another big frame for our conversation today is that it's not good enough just to evaluate the student. We also have to evaluate the instructional environment that the student is learning within, because it's impossible to make a diagnosis of a reading disability like dyslexia in the absence of instruction. We have to gather information and assess the instructional environment as well. So the ideas that I'm sharing with you today come from a position paper that you can find on the Acadience Learning website under the publications and presentations. This is a white paper that you can download that will go through the framework that I'll be sharing with you today. So I encourage you to go and find that PDF document there. When we use Acadience reading for screening and progress monitoring, we do that within a specific decision-making framework that's called the outcomes-driven model. This is a process of systematically asking and answering questions with your screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring data. It's the same series of 5 questions, whether we're talking about all students at a grade level or an individual student that we might be concerned about. The first step to this outcomes-driven model is to identify and validate need for support. So dyslexia screening, or screening for any reading difficulty, would happen within this decision-making framework. And again, being focused on prevention and trying to identify students as early as possible at the beginning of kindergarten and early in every grade level. Today, we're going to use the framework for the definition of dyslexia that comes from the International Dyslexia Association. And there are a couple of aspects to this definition that I want to spend some time unpacking. Dyslexia is a neurobiological disorder in origin. So it is a difference in students' brains that manifests itself in their ability to read. And some aspects of this that are important to draw out. It's about the accurate and fluent recognition of words, and it's also evidenced and manifested in poor spelling and decoding skills. And this definition is helpful in terms of guiding us in what to do when we suspect a disability and in remediation of students who actually have been diagnosed as having a disability such as dyslexia. We're going to focus in on the phonological component of language. This has been found to be the basis of most reading disabilities and can be a clue, an early clue to a student who might be at risk for this kind of reading difficulty. And then we'll also talk about some sort of secondary characteristics as well. So I like to sort of structure a conversation about using Acadience reading for screening for dyslexia with these three main ideas. And we'll be unpacking each one of these as we go through the workshop today. So first of all, we're going to be looking for difficulty with essential reading skills. So not skills that are tangentially related to reading or somewhat important, but the essential reading skills, particularly around phonological awareness and decoding. Those are the real two hallmarks of a diagnosis for dyslexia, and also they serve as early warning signs and signals in terms of screening and early identification. We're going to be talking about students who not only have difficulties in these important skill areas, but they have had sustained difficulties over time. So it's one thing to screen students and identify those who are low on these skills. That's a first warning sign. But not everybody who's low on these skills has dyslexia. And so we have to provide instruction to students over a period of time. We have to measure their performance in light of that instruction. And we need to have a way of quantifying sustained lack of adequate progress. So what does it mean to make adequate progress? What does it mean to receive intensive support? And how did the student respond in that context? We'll be unpacking that a bit. And then finally, in the federal special education law around specific learning disabilities, there are some exclusionary criteria. You can't determine that a student has the disability if these things are present. And one of those exclusionary criteria is the lack of generally effective instruction. So if the student wasn't there to receive instruction, or if the instruction provided can't be identified as generally effective, then the federal law says that you can't make a diagnosis, a determination of eligibility for special education services under the specific learning disability category. So we'll be talking about how that plays out and what that looks like when you're using Acadience reading data for that decision making. And then towards the end, we'll take a look at this sort of category of other indicators. We'll look at a measure of rapid automatized naming as an additional risk factor or indicator, and we'll look at spelling as well. Those are two newer Acadience reading measures for screening that you may or may not be aware of. So I'll give you a little sneak peek into what those look like and how they factor in here. So let's take this first area of consideration, the idea that the student would be identified as having difficulty with essential reading skills. So what do we mean by essential reading skills? Well, over the last several decades, and more recently summarized in the National Reading Panel report, the research has converged around 5 essential early literacy skills that students must acquire on their path to being readers. So these are skills that are both predictive of reading performance down the road, so they function well as screeners, and they are skills that when we teach them, students become better readers. So there's a benefit, there's a payoff in students acquiring these skills. That's what causes them to rise to the level of being essential. Acadience reading was designed to be a set of indicators of these essential skills. So you can see how the names of the Acadience reading measures line up to the essential skill areas. There are 2 indicators with Acadience reading of phonemic awareness: first sound fluency and phoneme segmentation fluency. We use first sound fluency at the beginning of kindergarten as sort of a placeholder, an early indicator, because PSF is too difficult at the beginning of kindergarten for the vast majority of students. We get lots of zeros if we ask students to segment phonemes at the beginning of K. So first sound fluency functions as a more age-appropriate indicator of phonological awareness at the beginning of kindergarten. We don't want to wait until the middle of kindergarten to start screening students. We want to do it very early on at the beginning of kindergarten. Why? Not for diagnosis purposes, but so that we can act on that information right away. What we do in the classroom matters a lot. So if we find students at the beginning of kindergarten who are missing this essential skill, they don't have a clue about sounds in spoken words, then we need to act on that information immediately, start providing that instructional support, even perhaps in the regular education classroom, to all of the students. We have an indicator of the alphabetic principle and basic phonics called nonsense word fluency. This one is used from the middle of kindergarten through the beginning of 2nd grade for universal screening of all students. We have the very elegant and efficient oral reading fluency that indicates advanced phonics and word attack skills, the ability to read accurately and fluently in connected text, and it is an excellent indicator of reading comprehension. It's used for screening from the middle of 1st grade all the way through 6th grade, and now with the extension of Acadience reading up into junior high and high school as well. We have an additional indicator of reading comprehension called MAZE. This is a silent reading comprehension indicator that's used in grades 3 through 6 only, also part of the extension upward into grades 7 through 12. And there is a 5th essential early literacy skill, vocabulary, that is indicated in sort of secondary ways in ORF and MAZE, not a direct measure that's part of Acadience reading currently, although there's an experimental measure called word use fluency that you can access if you're interested in that. And then we have the extra letter naming fluency indicator that's not telling us about any of these big 5 essential skills, but it's a risk indicator. It's predictive of reading in the future. It is a skill that we can teach. We can teach the heck out of letter naming. We should be teaching letter naming and letter sound together. But when we teach letter names, it doesn't have that instructional payoff in terms of better reading outcomes. If we're just teaching letter naming in isolation, that doesn't help support students to be better readers in the same way that, for example, phonemic awareness does. So letter naming doesn't rise to that level of priority like to become an essential early literacy skill like these others are. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying about letter naming. We should be teaching it. We just should be teaching it along with the sound and how to write the symbol. That would be ideal. What's essential is that letter sound combination that's measured by NWF. So those are the essential skills. That's what we're measuring. It should be lined up very closely with what we're teaching to all students K to 3. Now let's talk a little bit about what it means to have a difficulty in one of these skill areas. One of the values of Acadience reading screening is that in a few minutes, you can very accurately predict which students are going to be okay in the future and which students are going to struggle unless they get instructional support. This is what the benchmark goal tells you. It's designed to be the lowest level of okay performance. The benchmark goal is designed to be the score above which students have an 80 to 90% chance of being an okay reader in the future. So it's not a 100% guarantee, but the odds are in your favor. If a student meets that minimum expectation of the benchmark goal, they're likely to be okay in the future. So we want every student at least to be at that benchmark goal. Students who score below benchmark have about a 40 to 60% chance of being an okay reader in the future unless we do something about it. So we should be carefully thinking about students who score in this category. 50-50 odds are not great. We might be planning some change to their instruction. Monitoring their progress more frequently would be appropriate. And students who score in the well below benchmark range have scored in a way that predicts that they're going to be okay in the future only about 10 to 20% of the time. So this is a real warning sign. This is our call to action. As soon as we see a student scoring in the well below benchmark range, we should take action immediately. This is like hearing the tornado siren going off and go straight to your basement, right? If you live in a place where there is a basement, go straight to the safest place. That's what we should do with students who score well below benchmark. Don't take a wait and see approach. Don't see if in a couple of weeks things might be better. Act on that information immediately after the screening. Because the benchmark goal is the minimum expectation, once students have reached the benchmark goal, we want to work to get them to the above benchmark score. This is where students have an even better chance of being okay readers in the future. So keeping in mind that the benchmark goal is the lowest level of okay performance, the first score that we would interpret when we have screened all of our students 3 times a year is the reading composite score. This is a collection of important skills that are more predictive than any single skill. So the composite is giving us that first glance overall picture of a student's literacy health. It's helping us make decisions for sorting students into 2 broad groups: who's likely to be okay if we keep doing what we've been doing, who is not likely to be okay unless we change instruction. That's what screening is doing for us. In the composite, each individual measure contributes approximately equally, and what goes into the composite shifts and changes over time to match that progression of skills that students have to acquire on their path to reading. So the composite score first, and then the individual measure scores need to be interpreted for making these decisions about who's at risk. So difficulty, so within this category or concept of screening for disabilities like dyslexia, difficulty with an essential reading skill would be something like scoring in the below benchmark range on the composite and or individual measures, or scoring in the well below benchmark range. We would say those students are having substantial difficulty with one of these essential reading skills. This is the graphic that we always use to bring these ideas together. At the top, you see in blue those 5 essential early literacy skills. There's a general progression to reading comprehension that'll look very much like your framework for the simple view of reading. You can imagine overlaying Hollis Scarborough's rope model onto this. It's about students acquiring language comprehension and having that interact with their decoding skills. And the product of those 2 is resulting in reading comprehension. What we're doing with Acadience reading is simply taking the temperature of students 3 times a year, assessing indicators of those essential skill areas. And it's the benchmark goal that tells us if the student is on track with that skill area or if they need support. Those benchmark goals represent the minimum level of performance, and they increase over time. So at the middle of year and end of year, we expect student scores on those indicator skills to go up. So we can see if a student is having difficulty with these essential early literacy skills with different reports in the Acadience data management system. This is an example of a classroom report. This is one of the great ways to see which students are having difficulty with the essential early literacy skills that are particularly related to reading disabilities like dyslexia. So we can see indicators of phonemic awareness and basic phonics, the word level reading skills. And those are the indicators PSF and NWF. So for example, at the beginning of first grade, students who are scoring below or well below benchmark on those two key indicators, PSF and NWF, those are students who would be on our radar in terms of providing some immediate instructional support. So here we've identified two students who fit this kind of category, Evelyn and Otis, who are showing a high degree of risk of not being readers at the end of first grade. That's what these well below benchmark scores tell us. They only have a 10 to 20% chance of being readers at the end of first grade unless we do something about it. So there certainly are other students in this classroom who are also at risk and having difficulty with these skills, but Otis and Evelyn are showing up as having substantial difficulty. So this is, again, not something that we should wait and see or give them the gift of time. Let's see how it plays out in the first half of the school year. No, this goes straight to action in terms of providing support around those skills. So the second area of conceptualizing using Acadience reading screening data for identifying reading disabilities or screening for reading disabilities is this concept of serious lack of adequate progress or even resource intensive progress. So the idea that it's not enough just to be low on a skill. Lots of students could be low on the skill, but for some students, when we start teaching the skill, when we provide some high quality instruction in those skills, their performance is going to increase. Students with disabilities are ones who are a little bit more stubborn. It's going to take more than the run-of-the-mill instruction to get those students to learn these skills. They're going to need more explicit instruction. They're going to need more repetitions, more practice, more opportunities to cement those pathways in their minds. It's not that they can't learn to read, but what it's going to take to get them there is going to be a little bit more and different than what it might take other students. So we're measuring, as part of our investigation about disabilities like dyslexia, we're measuring their sustained or serious lack of adequate progress over time. And we're measuring it on those essential skills that we've just been talking about. And we're measuring their progress over time in light of instruction in these skills. Even if we have to provide intensive support, we want to see how students are progressing with that level of support. So one of the things that we've often wondered about and questioned is, what is adequate support, or what is adequate progress? What does it mean to lack adequate progress? What does it mean to not progress? These are questions that we've always had. How much growth is enough, right? Would be another way that we ask the same question. So in the Acadience data management system, we now have a tool called Pathways of Progress. This is a tool for helping you identify how much progress is typical. The pathways logic depends on the student's level of initial skills. So this is different from a rate of improvement approach, where you're simply taking where is the student starting, what's the goal in the future, and subtracting and dividing by the number of weeks you have. This is taking just the students who are starting the year with the same level of skills that your student has. So in this case, it would be lower performing students. And the pathways logic also is reflecting how did those subset of students end the year. So we're not just looking at the difference between the start and end point, but we're taking that subgroup of students, following them over time, seeing how they ended the year, and then drawing bands, what we call pathways, through their end of year scores to represent how much growth is typical. I think I've mentioned these things, and so I'm going to go here and show it to you in a picture. This is a cover of one of the free downloadable progress monitoring booklets. This is for oral reading fluency at level 3. This is showing words correct per minute on the left-hand side, and showing a 3rd grade student who's starting the school year with a screening score on words correct per minute that's below benchmark. This is a student who is in need of instructional support, currently not on track to be an okay reader at the end of the year. We want to be doing something about this from the beginning of the year. But how much growth is adequate? How much growth can we expect? How much growth is typical? That's what the Pathways of Progress tool is going to help you with. So the tool is taking all 3rd grade students, narrowing it down to just the 3rd graders who started the year with the same level of skills that this student started with, and it's reflecting to you where did that subgroup end the year. So all the 3rd graders in the database who started the year as this student did, some of them ended the year kind of low, like where you see this little yellow dot. Others who started at the same place ended the year much higher, and some students ended sort of in between. This is the information that we use to quantify and describe typical progress, above typical progress, or even below or well below typical progress. So it's based on this subset of students who were followed over time, and it's drawing these bands or pathways through their end of year scores so that we can quantify what we would describe as typical progress. We can do this same process with students who have different beginning of year scores, every beginning of year score. Here's how it might look like for a very low performing 3rd grade student. These are the pathways for a different beginning of year starting place. Typical growth for a student who starts the year like this would be ending the year somewhere down in here. You can see that it's a different, what represents typical or above typical progress is dependent on the beginning of year scores. It's customized to the beginning of year scores. Here's a picture of what this would look like for a high performing student. Typical growth for students who start the year quite high is ending the year at a different place. Students' growth is dependent on where they started the year, and it's reflected in where other students ended the year. This is the overall framework for those descriptors that are talking about progress for students. So you can see in the Acadience data management system, we're talking about typical progress as being the end score that's between the 40th and 59th percentile. We're going to describe it as typical progress. You'll see that language. You'll see it described as pathway 3 on some of the reports. You'll even see it reported as 3-star growth or 3-star progress. The above typical progress is going to be described as 4-star growth, and well above typical progress would be for this same subgroup of students, the 80th percentile and above at the end of the year. We call that well above typical growth, and you'll see it reported as pathway 5. You'll see it as a blue line on the graph or above, or 5-star progress. We're even going to be describing and looking at growth that could be described as below typical or well below typical. So a framework for thinking about this is that students who are starting the year below or well below benchmark are probably going to need to make above typical progress to catch up. So that's something to keep in mind. So how do we quantify serious lack of adequate progress? How do we quantify progress that's based on having resource intensive supports? So lack of adequate progress would be students who are growing in this below typical range, pathway 2, 2-star progress. We'd say that that is not adequate progress. Students who are making only 1-star progress on pathway 1, well below typical growth, we would say that that's a severe lack of adequate progress. Typical progress and above is what we would describe as adequate. And in some cases, for those low performing students, typical growth isn't even going to be adequate. We're looking for above or well above typical. Here's what it looks like on one of the progress monitoring graphs from Acadience Data Management. This is an example for that student we identified earlier as being quite low in an important indicator when we're screening for dyslexia. This was Evelyn. She was quite low on the NWF scores. So she's getting some support to match sound to symbol, and we're monitoring her progress with the correct letter sound score on NWF. Here she is at the beginning of the year, scoring well below benchmark. The benchmark goal for the beginning, middle, and end of the year is shown on this graph as a green horizontal line. And we can see that her odds of being an okay reader at the end of the year, based on this beginning of year score, are quite low, just about 10 to 20% odds, since she's scoring well below benchmark. If we got her to the end of year benchmark goal, that would be a meaningful amount of growth, because her odds would become 80 to 90%, and we'd be much more confident about her reading skills in the future. It certainly looks ambitious to go from here, well below benchmark, to here, at or above benchmark. And what we sometimes have wondered about in the past is how typical is it to go from this score at the beginning of the year to this score at the end of the year. That's what the Pathways of Progress information is informing you about. And you see this information at the beginning of the year. You'll see these colorful diagonal lines. They can show up on your student's progress monitoring graph. They show up in the goal setting tool in Acadience Data Management, and they tell you how much growth is typical for students who started the year with scores like Evelyn. So again, not comparing to every other first grader, but students who scored like Evelyn. So in between this darker green line and this light green line that's barely visible, this range right in here is pathway 3, what we would call typical progress for a student who started the year like Evelyn did. So at the beginning of the year, we have this information. What is adequate growth going to look like? We can use that to set a progress monitoring goal, like this teacher did. It's this blue target on the graph. We want this student to make progress that is above typical so that we close the gap and catch her up to the benchmark goal. Now, the important part is that we watch this progress monitoring data, these open circles, during the school year while we're teaching, and we use that to make decisions about the instruction we're providing. If we are seeing that the student is not tracking towards the goal that we set, we can make a change to instruction, and that's what this vertical blue line indicates on the graph, that instruction changed at this point in time, and we are perhaps intensifying the instructional support on our pursuit of what it's going to take for this student to make adequate progress. We don't want to be satisfied with students not growing or not making adequate progress. We want to be driven towards enabling learning for all students. So here's an example of the second student who bubbled up after the screening. This is an example with Otis, and this is showing that in some cases, students require very intensive and individualized supports in order to make progress. This is where your MTSS model is going to come into play. This is where it's important for you to make sure you're using your Tier 1 instruction to reduce risk so that you can provide very intensive and individualized supports to a smaller number of students so that you actually can do things like provide 45 to 60 minutes of intervention each day, in addition to the 90 to 120 minutes of core instruction in a very small group with a really tight range of skills that are needed by students in that group. So that's what I mean by intensive support. If you find that intensive instructional support is what it takes to get adequate progress for a student, that is part of your decision making about referring for a comprehensive special education evaluation and quantifying or capturing this information into an IEP to protect this service for the student. So it's important that we're not just documenting failure as we're doing this progress monitoring, that we're actually finding what works for students. Whoops. So a couple of ways of looking at adequate progress. In this case, we're looking at the Pathways of Progress report that can be generated at the middle or end of the school year. So if you didn't get to do your end of year screening this year, you can generate this from your middle of year screening results. And this is going to tell us about the progress for everybody in Evelyn's classroom. It's going to tell us about Evelyn's progress, Otis's progress, and about how much progress did every student make in our classroom. In the first column, we're seeing the beginning of year composite score for each student. In the far right column, we see the middle of year composite score for each student. And the shading of that square tells us if that score was at or above benchmark, it would be fully shaded in. If the score was below benchmark, it would be halfway shaded in. And if it was well below benchmark, it would be an open square like the one you're seeing here. So in this case, Evelyn scored well below benchmark at the beginning of the year. She was still well below benchmark at the middle of the year on the composite, but the column right next to that shows us the stars that reflect the amount of progress she made. Even though she's still well below benchmark on the composite, her progress was typical compared to other students who started with this same composite score. So we would say that her progress is typical. She's making at least typical growth. We could describe that as adequate. And we would also be able to, if I move this out of the way, I think I'm able to see that her progress was typical compared to other students. So another way of looking at this idea of progress and growth over time when you're screening for disabilities like dyslexia is to think about the instruction that students have been provided. And you have to rule out that they actually got generally effective instruction. So how do we know if instruction is generally effective? How will we make that determination? We can see with our Acadience reading data that there's evidence for generally effective instruction at the school level, and we'll look at examples of that. We can see if there are students in each classroom that are making progress that would indicate that that classroom is providing generally effective instruction. We can also look at this in terms of small groups, that if there are some students in the small group progressing, but not one of the students, that would be another way of showing evidence that the instruction was generally effective. So let's look at each one of these with examples from the Acadience data management system. One of the best ways to use your screening data is to reflect the effectiveness of the classroom instruction that all students are receiving at Tier 1. That's the purpose of screening, so that you can improve and change what you're doing for all students at Tier 1 if you're not getting at least 80% of your students to the Acadience reading benchmark goals. Remember that these numbers add up to 100% because every student should be at least at that minimum cut point at the benchmark goal. It's the lowest score that predicts okay reading in the future. So the best way to get all students to these benchmark goals is to start with first reading instruction that gets the majority of students to the benchmark goals, so 80%. Then we need a second tier of instructional support, a system of tertiary prevention of reading failure to get another 15% of students to the benchmark goals. And then it's going to take that very intensive and individualized system of support to get the last 5% of students to the benchmark goals. If your system is not getting the vast majority of students to benchmark with regular classroom instruction in Tier 1, then that's your starting place. It would be difficult to say that any individual student like Otis or Evelyn has a disability or should have additional assessment to consider a disability unless you're getting most students to these minimum benchmark goals with your general classroom instruction. So one of the reports that's helpful for reflecting on this is the school overview in Acadience Data Management. This is an example for first grade, and it's showing you the percent of students who have scored in each of the 3 score categories at the beginning, middle, and end of the year. This row is just showing the composite. That's a pretty good overall representation of the literacy health of students in this grade level. So if our instruction for all students, not our intervention system, but the way that we're teaching all students, if it is minimizing risk and getting most students to the benchmark goals, to the minimum expectations, then we would say that our instruction is generally effective. So in this case, they started with about 56% of the first graders who were on track, but by the middle of the year, 82% of the first graders were on track. That's really good evidence. That's a firm leg to stand on to say our instruction is generally effective. It's working to meet the needs of the students in front of us. We're not relying on intervention outside of the classroom. We're maximizing our instructional minutes, the 90 to 120 minutes of core reading instruction. It's lined up and differentiated to the needs of the students in front of us, and it's accelerating their learning, causing them to catch up. And look, it wasn't just a fluke. Even when the skills change, even when the goals increase, they kept those students on track and even got more students on track by the end of first grade. So if your grade level teams are not currently using this overview report to have conversations about your Tier 1 instruction, I encourage you to take that next step as soon as you're back in school. This is really important. It's important for improving outcomes for all students. It's an important consideration when we're trying to determine which student might have a disability. So you can see at the beginning of the school year, it would be impossible to know which student has a disability, right? We don't know enough at that point. Half of the students are scoring in a really scary way that predicts not good things for them in the future. Which one of those students has a disability? Impossible to say. We have to first demonstrate that our instructional systems are effective at teaching reading. And that's what this overview report is showing you. So in addition to the overview, another way of analyzing the effectiveness of your general instruction, your Tier 1 system of supports, is the effectiveness report, also available in Acadience Data Management. This one is a little bit more complex because it's showing you how students did not just at a single point in time, but how they also did at a second point in time. So in this report, we're looking at beginning of year outcomes across the top row with these percents. It's the exact same information that we saw here, the beginning of year overview report. And in the bottom row, we're seeing how did students in each of these score categories end up at the middle of the year. So for example, at the beginning of the year, there were 43 students, which was 60% of all first graders, 43 students who scored at or above benchmark on the composite. At the middle of the year, we actually lost 2 of those students. 2 of the 43 fell into the below benchmark category, but 41 of them were still at the benchmark for the composite at the middle of the year. This is good evidence that at least for the students who start the year on track, our core instruction is effective at keeping them on track. Our intervention systems We could argue are generally effective. Our Tier 2 system of support is catching up 73% of the students who start the year below benchmark. And our Tier 3 system of support is represented here. It's catching up about 67%. So this is a target of opportunity. We could improve what we're doing for students who are scoring well below benchmark. But at least in terms of the students who start the year on track, we're keeping most of them on track throughout the year. Another layer of analysis of determining if our instruction has been generally effective is to look at the classroom level. So the overview report could be run at the classroom level. The effectiveness report that I just showed you could be run at the classroom level. But you also can look at classroom effectiveness in terms of growth. So this is the Pathways Summative Growth Report. Now this one can only be generated at the end of the year. So if you want to see your results, you'd have to go back to the prior school year if you didn't do an end of year screening in 2020. This is talking about the amount of growth that your students made. It's aggregating that Pathways growth for each of your students and comparing it to other students, other classrooms nationally. So you're getting a national normative perspective on how effective you were at growing your students across the school year. So you can see in Evelyn's classroom, she is learning in a fairly effective context where 65% of the students are making typical progress or better. When we compare that amount of growth to other first grade classrooms, we would describe it as average classroom reading progress. Again, this is just checking the boxes. Can we feel confident that this is not an instructional environment problem that is causing Otis and Evelyn to look like they have significantly low scores and that they have not progressed over time? We're ruling out the possibility that it was something about the instructional environment. So the final way that we would quantify this concept of generally effective instruction is by looking at what's happening in small groups for students that we're concerned about. So we're not basing decisions about suspecting disabilities with a single measurement. We are getting a much broader picture. Even though these are very brief indicator measures, there's lots of rich information that can be gleaned here. And so what's going on in the small group intervention that a student like Evelyn is receiving can be very informative. So this is the report from her small group intervention. It's showing progress monitoring for Evelyn in blue, and it's showing progress monitoring for 3 other students who are in her same small group. So you can see they all started the year fairly low, and you can see what happened to them over time. These are the students who are grouped together for their intervention. They're getting the same targeted intervention support. And over time, 3 of the students in this small group started to take off. They actually ended up reaching the benchmark goal and even the above benchmark goal on this skill. But with that exact same instruction, and she actually was there to get it, she wasn't absent or something like that, Evelyn did not grow like the other students did. This is starting to add to the decision making about her sustained lack of progress, even though she got a school, a grade level that was providing generally effective instruction. She was in a classroom that was providing generally effective instruction, meaning it worked for most kids. And she was in a small group that was providing generally effective instruction. It worked for others. It wasn't working for her. So this doesn't help us to know exactly what to do for Evelyn instead, but it is helping us move forward in making a decision about, this is a student who needs some more intensive and individualized instruction. So this is what we've been unpacking so far. in this presentation is those definitive indicators of risk for reading disabilities like dyslexia, using our screening data to find students who have severely low skills in essential skill areas, particularly around word reading, phonics and decoding skills, and phonemic awareness skills. And it's helping us to look at their progress and growth over time. How do they compare to other students? Has their progress been typical or not? And if their growth or their lack of growth has either been sustained over time, so in spite of effective instruction, they haven't grown like other students, or what it takes for them to grow has been resource intensive. Those are the ways that we can use our screening data to make those decisions. We feel very confident about the use of those indicators in these ways. There are two newer indicators with Acadience reading, and you would have these available to you when you download the assessment for next school year, or if you purchase the assessment from the publisher Voyager Sopris Learning. The new measures, RAN and spelling, will be part of those classroom kits in kindergarten and first grade. And so I just wanted to briefly introduce you to those measures and invite you to explore them and learn more about them. Rapid automatized naming is it's an indication of the amount of time or the difficulty that students might have with naming. And this seems to be related. There's lots of research evidence about the relationship between this rapid naming and reading performance. So if we want to be screening students, particularly in kindergarten and first grade when it's most helpful, we are adding in the option of screening on rapid automatized naming with Acadience RAN. This functions as a predictor of reading skills. It's an additional way for you to triage who needs immediate instructional support. Phonological awareness is the primary indicator. We're not budging from that. We don't have any data to knock it off of its pedestal as being the primary indicator. So we're still using FSF and PSF primarily, but we can add to that the additional risk indicator of rapid automatized naming. Just like LNF, there's no evidence that improving RAN results in better reading. In fact, it's the opposite. Improving reading improves your RAN. So it's not that we want you to now set up a RAN center in your classroom or to be I don't know, doing something instructionally to improve RAN. That's not a good use of your time. What this is for is risk status. The addition of the RAN assessment is going to help you know which students who are low on FSF or which students who are low on PSF should go straight to your priority list at the top. Which students should you prioritize for instructional support? So Acadience RAN includes an objects assessment. You can see that this is a naming task where there are these alternating objects in rows on the page. There's also a RAN letters task. And because this could be used in kindergarten, there might be some students who don't name letters accurately yet. And so the alternate to the RAN letters task is a numbers task. And it's also available in Spanish. There are no benchmark goals yet that I'm aware of. If there are, it's a very recent addition. But you will get normative information reported to you from Acadience Data Management. The spelling assessment is also a new addition to the Acadience reading assessments, also available for kindergarten and first grade. This functions also as a risk indicator. You've heard a lot in this literacy symposium about reading and writing, phonics and spelling being two sides of the same coin. So a spelling assessment as part of your screening gives you an additional window into a student's word level decoding skills. It gives you a window into their phonemic awareness skills. It's going to give you another lens into which students need the most immediate and most intensive instructional supports. So the spelling assessment is done by dictation, and it's scored based on the number of words that were spelled correctly and the correct spelling sequences. So a more fine-grained way of scoring if the student spelled the letter sequentially correctly. Okay, that was a quick introduction into those two measures, and if there are questions, I will do my best to explore them. But to wrap us up here before we open things up to questions, just want to remind us all of the purpose. We've been talking about early screening for reading disabilities like dyslexia. The purpose is not diagnosis of dyslexia. The purpose is acting on the information to provide the skills that students need as soon as possible. You can see how these measures can be used over time as part of a decision, perhaps about identification of a disability like dyslexia, but we can't make that kind of diagnosis or determination without instruction. So instruction is the primary purpose for all of our screening activities. And we want to make sure that the instruction you're providing in these early literacy skills is systematic, explicit, and very engaging. And hopefully you have accessed Anita Archer's presentations at this literacy symposium, or heard her speak at another point in time, or at the very least been to her website and read her amazing book. If you've been to her presentations, you've heard many of her really fun but very important Archerisms, like teach the stuff and lose the fluff, right? Like, she keeps us really on track. If you need to supercharge your instruction in early literacy and your school's not adopting a new core program, they're not going to send you to training, the very best thing you can do is get Anita's book. It will help you to supercharge the way that you're teaching these skills with whatever program or materials you might have. If you have an opportunity for professional development, we really recommend the letters training that was authored by Louisa Moats. It is published by Voyager Sopris, just like the Acadience assessments are published. And we know that within Pennsylvania, the patent folks are providing letters training. I think mostly that's for free in Pennsylvania. You can access that through patent or perhaps through your intermediate unit. And if you're not in Pennsylvania, we encourage you to access letters training anyway. It is so worth the investment. It is not a program. It is teacher knowledge. It will help you teach reading better with whatever program or materials you have, because it gives you knowledge of the English language and how it gets mapped to print. So seek out training in letters if you want to improve your reading instruction. So these are some final thoughts here to leave you with before we open things up for questions. Starting early is always our message. Focusing your instruction and assessment on the essential reading skills. For some students, you're going to have time to teach other things, but every student needs to acquire those big five. Make sure your assessments are focused on indicators of those essential reading skills that are predictors of important reading outcomes. And the most important piece is to use the information. Act on the information, especially for students who score below and well below benchmark. Make sure you're providing instructional support, monitoring their progress over time, and changing the instruction if you see the student isn't growing. This is the way that we're thinking about the big ideas related to screening for reading disabilities like dyslexia, that we're doing that in a context of prevention and intervention, that we're using the outcomes-driven model to prioritize the things we can do something about and actually doing something about them. So it's not just about diagnosis, it's about early action and prevention. And we want to be assessing not just the student and their performance, but also the instructional environment. So I'm going to pause here and see if Jenny has been collecting.
I have been collecting a lot of questions. So
a lot of questions. Okay, good. I'm glad I left a few minutes here.
So the first question is as kind of just a general question. Is Acadience similar to Dibble's 8th edition?
No, not at all. Dibble's 8th edition is a different test. It's from a different set of authors. And Acadience reading is a separate test. It's unrelated to Dibble's 8th. It's not supported by the authors of Acadience. Acadience is the current name for what you may have known as Dibble's Next or Dibble's 6th edition. The program of assessments known as Dibble's previously, Dibble's Next and prior, are from Roland Good and Ruth Kaminsky. They are the owners of Acadience Learning, and that test is now called Acadience Reading.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple questions on composite scores. From Amanda, is it correct that we should never compare composite scores from the beginning to the end of year for a particular student?
So the composite score, particularly in K-2, changes over time. What goes into the composite at the beginning, middle, and end of the year changes because students are acquiring the basic skills. And so they're moving through that pathway from phonemic awareness to phonics to accurate and fluent reading of text. So what goes into the composite changes to match that progression of skills over time. Therefore, you're correct. We shouldn't compare an individual student's composite score beginning to middle of year. We shouldn't look for a student to grow on their composite score because the composites are different collections of skills at those 2 points in time. We can look for NWF to grow across the year. We can look for ORF scores on accuracy or words correct or retell to increase across the year. We can look for PSF to increase across the year. It's the same thing across the year every time we give it. But the composite score is not the same entity across the year. So we interpret the composite score at a single point in time. It's the first score we interpret, but we're not going to look back to see, did the student's composite score increase since the beginning of the year like we could with the individual measure scores. So I hope that helps. Maybe there's follow-up to that.
There's a couple of other questions. There might be follow-ups to that. How do you know if the increase in composite score is completely due to good classroom instruction and not extra reading support?
Yeah, so I think you mean the increase in the percent of students at the composite score. How do you know if that's due to the first reading instruction or intervention that you might have provided? And that's where the effectiveness report comes in. The overview report is just showing you percent at benchmark over time, but the effectiveness report is going to let you parse out for those students who started the year at benchmark, where was their percent at benchmark at the middle or end of the year. So that's one way to tease out that piece of information.
Thank you. And let's see here. How can a student attain at benchmark in all 3 end-of-year kindergarten assessments, but still have a composite score that falls under or below benchmark?
Yeah, great question. This is really hard to answer without the visual aid that matches the question, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to rephrase the question first and make sure I understand it. So a student, I think it was that their individual measure scores at the end of kindergarten are below benchmark?
Correct, I think so. Carly, if I'm not answering correctly, go ahead and put that in the chat box, but I think that's what she meant.
So the individual measure scores are below benchmark, but the composite score is at benchmark, is the scenario, I think I remember.
Sorry, other way around. So a student can attains at benchmark on all the measures.
So the opposite.
Okay, so she clarified. Thanks, Carly. The individual scores are all at benchmark and the composite is below.
Yeah, so individual measure scores, so that's going to be PSF and NWF at benchmark at the end of kindergarten, but the composite score is below benchmark. How in the world can that happen? Well, to answer that question, you need to know 2 things at least. You need to know what goes into the composite at the end of kindergarten. sometimes we're assessing things that are part of the screening that don't contribute to the composite at that grade or time of year. And letter naming fluency goes into the composite because letter naming is a risk indicator. It's a really good sorting tool. It helps us prioritize who needs help and who doesn't. So you have to know what goes into the composite. That'll help you tease out why this pattern can happen. And you have to know what the benchmark goal is. So in the scenario where the student is at the benchmark for individual measures, did I get that wrong again? They're below benchmark for individual measures. It can happen either way, so I'm getting confused.
Yeah, and she said, and Carly says, I guess the student cannot retain letter names. So you probably answered her question already, but yes, all her individual scores were at benchmark and the composite was below.
Yeah, so probably those individual measure scores are just barely at the benchmark, and probably that composite score is just barely below the benchmark, and probably the student can't name very many letters.
Right.
So what that below benchmark composite is telling you is an elevated risk status. And it may be an elevated risk status overall because the student was just at the minimum. The benchmark goal is the minimum. They're hanging on by their fingernails. Even though the score might have a green symbol next to it, it's just barely at the minimum, just barely at the benchmark goal. And if they can't name very many letters, that sort of heaves them over into the category of being at risk. Because if a student hasn't learned by the end of kindergarten how to name letters, that elevates their risk status. It means it's perhaps going to be more difficult to maintain and increase their phonemic awareness skills and their phonics skills. And so you want to draw that student to your attention. You want to make sure that they're on your radar and that you're opening up the booklet to see what those PSF and NWF scores actually look like. How did the student achieve those scores? Maybe they got to benchmark on PSF by going onset rhyme, at. They didn't actually segment all the phonemes in the word. So it's a little indication that there's more to the story. You should investigate further when you see that kind of a pattern.
And kind of to that end, Heather wanted to know why then the difference in letter naming between January, which is 55, and May, which is 51 in kindergarten.
There are no benchmark goals for letter naming fluency. So there actually never have been. And the reason why there aren't benchmark goals for letter naming is because it's not one of the big 5 essential early literacy skills. It doesn't rise to that same level of priority. Teaching letter names in isolation doesn't translate into being a better reader down the road. So we don't want to give you a goal to try to get students to because there's no instructional payoff in that. It's not going to result in a better reader. Whereas the phonics skills and the phonemic awareness skills, if students get to the goals on PSF and NWF, there is a straight line payoff to reading comprehension in the future. That doesn't exist for letter naming. It's a risk indicator. It is not your best instructional target, letter names in isolation. So we don't give you a benchmark goal for letter naming. We don't give you progress monitoring materials for letter naming.
Thank you. Mindy asks, on the example data from the first grade classroom, Nathan Cruz showed well below benchmark for composite score. His NWF, both correct letter sounds and whole words read were above benchmark, but his PSF was below benchmark. Would he be a student to receive tier 2 instruction even though his NWF scores were at or above benchmark?
So are you referring to a student that's in the presentation? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yep, the first grade classroom data.
Nathan, right here. This is Nathan, and Nathan had a composite score well below benchmark. Looked like he was at the 11th percentile in letter naming. He was well below benchmark on PSF, at benchmark on NWF, correct letter sounds and whole words read, but looks like just barely at the correct letter sounds goal. So decisions about tiers of support aren't made directly from screening results. Now, this is a whole other presentation beyond the scope of the time that we have here, but this is a very common mistake that I addressed in the MTSS mess ups presentation that I did yesterday. So you'll be able to access that eventually on the Patent YouTube channel. This is a mistake that people make, equating scores on screening measures to tiers of support. What I want you to think about, two things here. This pattern of scores for this student indicates that this is a student who needs support, right? Nathan is a student who needs support. I'm not going to deny that. Nobody would. He needs support in what? Phonemic awareness, letter name, and sound. This is barely at the benchmark goal. So I'm going to be supporting him on both phonemic awareness, letter name, and sound. And I'm going to provide that support to him like right away. How I'm going to provide that support, I wish I could delete this, this call out here, but I think you can get the gist. How I'm going to provide that support is primarily in my tier 1 instruction. Half of the class, and if this was uncovered, you'd see that more than half of the class is scoring below and well below benchmark on critical early literacy indicators. So it wouldn't make sense for me to try to send 2/3 of my class for tier 2 support. I'm going to overwhelm my tier 2 system like in a matter of days. What I need to do in this particular context is to improve the first reading instruction that I'm providing in tier 1. I want to differentiate that classroom reading instruction. I can do that with the grouping report that is available in Acadience Data Management. That'll be very helpful for that differentiation. And I want to make sure I'm meeting all students' needs through the first reading instruction in tier 1. So there's a lot more we could say about that, but I'm afraid we don't have time. I'm just dropping that here at 3:12.
So I know there are several more questions. Do you want to take one more? Or
Sure, yeah.
Okay, we'll do one more, and then I don't know if you have, let's see, an email you want to share, or if you want to direct them to a website.
So you can always send questions to Acadience, info at acadiancelearning.org, info at acadiancelearning.org, and Acadience specific questions get answered very quickly at that customer service address. If you have a specific question for me about this presentation, stephaniestollar@gmail.com is a good way to reach me.
Thank you. Okay, then I think we have time for one more question. Who can diagnose dyslexia? Reading specialists or special ed teachers?
So school teams who have done a comprehensive evaluation can diagnose dyslexia. It's part of the federal special education law under the specific learning disability category. And the data that you collect with Acadience Reading in the way that I've been describing today, particularly if you are implementing multi-tiered systems of support, can be a very valuable source of data for making decisions about eligibility for special education services like dyslexia. The most important thing to keep in mind is find what works. Find what works to enable learning, have flexible service delivery that allows that to happen, and make sure that you are just simply continuing that intensive support that you found is needed for that student onto their IEP.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stollar. Greatly appreciate this presentation. It was wonderful. I'm going to put your email in the chat box. So can you say it one more time?
stephaniestollar@gmail.com, stephaniestollar@gmail.com. And I think at the end, I'm not sure the slide number. Oh, much further down, you can see the customer service email address for Acadience Learning, info@acadiancelearning.org.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I wanted to remind everybody that this session was recorded, so it will be up on the Patent YouTube site in the near future. Heather wanted to say, fantastic presentation, Dr. Stollar. I think a lot of people are saying that right now. Thank you so much for being with us, and enjoy the rest of your summer.